Is Nic Claxton worth $35 million? That is going to be a question the Nets might have to answer this offseason with some word that they plan to possibly match whatever offer comes from another team on the young center. We're going to talk about this and all other things Nic Claxton related. But first, the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am Doug Norrie, sitting solo for this one. No Adam Armbrecht, though I'm sure he was chomping at the bit. Champing? I always get that one wrong. At the bit to talk a little Nic Claxton news. From DFSR right over here. If you need any support over on DraftKings and or FanDuel, make sure you go check out DFSR. That's where I'm covering all the NBA projections. Got MLB up there as well. Obviously, though, it's all going to be about Nic Claxton today with word that came out this week that there was a chance, it's from one reporter at this point, Sean Devaney from Hoops Hype, also writes over at The Heavy, that had said that there was a chance that Nic Claxton was going to receive some offers this offseason from other teams and that the Nets were planning on matching whatever he was offered. This is big news. This is big news on the Nic Claxton front, especially considering where Nets folks have been wanting to sort of like know what's going to happen with their young center. Some playoff struggles. We'll get to that in a second here. Obviously, it was a roster that was kind of heavy on centers to begin with. But then you talk about a guy like Claxton, who's still relatively young, age 20, just coming off his age 23 season, and has a lot of promise, has shown a lot of upside in the past, definitely got better this year. But the question always becomes like, what do we pay these guys? What are the Nets going to be comfortable when it comes to actually throwing salary out there? Is Joe Tsai going to want to spend? They're already over the salary. They're already over the salary cap. They're already into the luxury tax. Every dollar out is not one for one anymore. And so it becomes hard to evaluate. And the two free agents that they have going into this season, obviously, are Bruce Brown, who is an unrestricted free agent. And then they have Claxton, a restricted free agent, meaning they can match any offer on them. So Devaney gets out there and says that he had talked to multiple GMs, or maybe just a GM, and that GM had talked about, that the Nets were going to be prepared to do it, and that there was going to be a chance that Claxton was going to kind of get somewhere in the 3 years to $35 million range. And when you start hearing those numbers and you look at Claxton sort of in the aggregate for what he is as a player at this point, I think there was a divided feeling among Nets folks around whether this was the correct number or not. This lands the Nets somewhere in the mid-level exception territory. It's going to be a little less than 335 that they can offer. It's something like, 10-1, then it escalates to 11-2 and then 11-8. So million, by the way. So it falls underneath the overall 35 million, but 35 million ends up becoming a nice round number when we're talking about where we land for a guy like Nic Claxton. And I think it was somewhat surprising for pretty much everybody to hear that the Nets were willing to kind of do this number, that this was going to be a number that they were ultimately comfortable with, that this is this is how maybe the rest of the league views a guy like Claxton at this point. And, where the Nets probably value him as well. Alex Schiffer from The Athletic did jump in there and say that he, confirmed, there was in a mailbag that they had done about the Nets. Schiffer confirmed that he had heard the same thing in his reporting about where the Nets land. Well, excuse me, two things: where other teams kind of landed when it came to Claxton and his overall value, and then where the Nets were going to probably land with wanting to match the salary. A couple teams were thrown out there like Charlotte and Chicago that could make offers. Restricted free agency is always a weird thing for other teams because you basically have to, just to give a little primer on that before we get back to Claxton, basically what has to happen with free agents, with restricted free agency, is another team has to offer the money, and then the Nets have a certain amount of time with which that they can go back and then match it. The reason it gets weird, like the home team in this case, like in the Nets case, The reason the home team is at an advantage is because they don't have to do it right away. I think it's 2 weeks after free agency starts. We know that free agency at this point basically starts on a day and ends on the day because all this stuff has been kind of taken care of behind the scenes well in advance. But where it puts the away team, another team that's offering the contract at a sort of a loss, is they need to sit around and wait. Like, that offer has to get thrown out there. If it doesn't get matched, the team has to be obliged to actually, go through with the offer. And while they wait, the rest of free agency kind of has to go on while the team with the initial offer sits around. And the home team, the Nets case, can go off and do what they want to do, see how the market plays out, and then decide if they're going to match in the end. So this is why sometimes you don't see tons of offer sheets given to guys, because it's not that these teams wouldn't want to add someone like Claxton necessarily. It's just that sitting around and waiting for it becomes really problematic. And if they don't accept it, or the other team matches it, then you're like totally left out in the cold because free agency has passed you by. You kind of had to sit on those dollars for a long time and wait. And then, nothing kind of happens. Now, that being said, it does seem like some of these teams might still think about throwing out an offer. But if there's a part where the Nets are putting it out there, and sometimes this is like the little trickery that goes on with this as well, is that when it gets reported that that the Nets are going to match any offer, like this has come out in this piece of reporting and this piece of covering the different news cycles, so let's say they plan to do it. Okay. I believe it. I believe they plan to do it. But think about what other side effect this has on these other teams. If you send out the smoke signal early that you are going to match any offer that another team puts out there, why would the other team even bother to do it? Right? Why would another team even bother to put that hold on their salary cap while they waited if they know the Nets are going to match it? And so this is a little bit of this, it's like a negotiation tactic / like a strategic advantage that the Nets have, that when you throw out there that you plan on doing this, basically it does two things. One, you kind of signal that you are in the market for a guy like Nic Claxton. And two, you possibly drive down the price for a guy like Claxton about bringing him back because there might not be any offers, right? Like, the market might not shake out, not because, again, the other teams didn't want the player, but because they just didn't want to sit around and wait. And so this is sort of like artificially drive down the market on a guy like Claxton and really just restricted free agency in general. So it's a funny little, give and take that we're going through here when it comes to the Nets. I think what's clear, though, what's becoming really clear from this stuff, and we'll get into Claxton as a player and what it means to bring him back for this kind of dollar sign. What's becoming clear is that the Nets do want to keep him, and I think they saw enough from him over the course of this season to make him part of at least the short term, like next few years plan in terms of their championship growth and championship equity. I think they saw enough from him on the court over the course of the season, maybe not with the free throws late over the last game of the playoffs, or really the whole last series of the playoffs. But they saw enough from his growth over the course of this season when he was finally given extended run that he could do enough on the court, and you can probably start dreaming on the upside as well. And for that number, like, this $10+ million in the open market, that seemed like probably a fair price for a young, fairly dynamic center. So I think that's kind of where we stand with Nic Claxton at this point. And I think that we're probably going to end up seeing him back in a Nets uniform. Now the question becomes, is this the right decision for the Nets? Because I think that's a different kind of question. Is Nic Claxton right for the team when it comes to bringing him back on this number? Or should they be, just going all in, let's say, on a guy who still has not played a ton of games in the NBA? We are going to talk about that in a second. First, got to talk to you about our friends over at Built Bar. Built Bar's got the new brownie batter puffs. Every week we're reading about a new Built Bar offering. That's because they just have put the focus on the flavors, making sure it tastes good, making sure it backs it up with the stats. 140 calories, 17 grams of protein, 7 grams of sugar. That's what the brownie batter puffs have. So they're good for you, and they're going to taste great. I know my kids and family go running for the boxes whenever Built Bar sends the re-up, because they have committed to making sure this stuff tastes great. 100% covered in real chocolate, making sure you're eating healthy and also enjoying it. Go to built.com, use the promo code LOCKED15, and you're going to get 15% off of your order. Use the promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. All right, Nic Claxton as a player. We put a poll out there last week, got over 1,000 responses over there on the Twitter. So thanks for everyone who weighed in hot and heavy on where they think they land with giving Nic Claxton a long-term contract that could total $35 million over the 3 years. This one was split right down the middle when it came to Nets folks. And me, you're out there, you probably voted in this as well. If you follow us over on Twitter at Locked On Nets, maybe you weighed in on what you thought about, where you landed on this money. Right now, 979 votes over on Twitter. 52% yes, wanted him back at 35 million. 48% no, did not want him back. So it's about as down the middle as you can get from a response. And I think it begs the question of, where we stand with Nic Claxton's value, what we think Nic Claxton is going to be as a player now and what he can become in the future, what Nic Claxton looks like a year or 2 years from now, and whether that money will, exceed, or his value and talent will exceed those kind of, eye-popping numbers. That this is in terms of dollar signs. This is a guy we talked about many times that I think we still don't know completely what he is as a player. I think we know things that he does really, really well, right? He's an excellent switch defender. He's an excellent help defender. He can grab weak side blocks. His frame, I think, is still filling out at 23. He's definitely put on mass since he came into the league at 6'11". He's at 215. I think there's probably a little bit more room for sort of girth growth over what his body can fill out to be. It's going to be hard for him to end up banging with the biggest centers in the league, but we saw him be able to hold his own for the most part. And really, at this kind of money, what you're starting to hope is that Nic Claxton eventually, or is going to be a starting center on your team, or at least a nominal starting center, whether he's your closing center in a championship team. I think that one's a little closer, although we definitely got some pieces this past year that showed that I think you can at least start dreaming on it, but that he can hold his own, 24, 25 minutes a game minimum, that he's going to be able to get out there and help them on the offensive end. We already know he can help a lot on the defensive end as that switch defender. And, there's parts of us, I think, that can still kind of dream on where he can grow as an offensive player. It's been a struggle at times for him in the offensive flow. We saw him get better about making reads on offense. I definitely think over the course of last season, we saw him, especially near the end, get a lot more confident around his finishing at the rim. For as many problems as he had in that Boston series at the foul line, he did not have those problems when it came to actually finishing the rim. The guy barely missed. Over the course of that Boston series, he was kind of automatic near the rim. He shot 80%, 79% from the field on 24 total attempts, right around 22 minutes a game. Obviously, the free throws were an unmitigated disaster. He basically missed everything, went 1 for 11 in the final game of that series, a game they only lost by 4 points to get swept by the Celtics. Don't need to do the back of the napkin math to know that if he hits 5 more of those, they win. I know that's not always kind of a 1-to-1 math problem, but you get what I mean. 1 for 11 in a close game is basically the difference of winning or losing a game. So I think that's clearly a problem. But, does the rest of his game beget, this kind of money? I think so. And I think what we saw from some of this reporting too was, and I can't remember if it was Schiffer or Devaney, and one of these guys did mention that there was a feeling among the Nets organization that the free throws were more of a blip than a problem. Once it got into his head early on that they weren't going down, that it became, in his head, he got the yips and the mechanics started to fail him. And when that happens, you can trend downhill pretty darn fast in terms of making your missing free throws. We've seen it happen with a ton of players over the years. We know this can be the case. It's not a great sign, for a big guy, but we also know that sometimes these things are correctable. Take a guy like Giannis, who was 2 seasons ago, was getting counted down at the free throw line in high leverage games because fans knew he was taking too long and it was totally in his head. And then all of a sudden, essentially overnight, he puts in the work, gets the mechanics down, gets the mental part of his game right. And now he's, not automatic at the free throw line, but fans don't do that to him anymore, right? He's making his free throws. So I wouldn't put that as a total knock on him. I know we tend to remember the things that we saw last about a player, and we want that to inform how we feel about his growth forward. I think sometimes that can be the case, but there's other times where it's completely overblown. And so with Claxton, I would kind of err and default on the side of like, that's really not who he is as a player overall, that he's not going to be a 1 for 11 free throw shooter for the rest of his career. I think that's ridiculous to feel that was going to be the way. So I'm not sure anyone really thinks that like on a serious level, but again, it's the last thing you saw. So you tend to remember it, but also remember that just about everything else he did in that series was great. Like the defense, I thought was really, really solid. He was able to switch on to multiple guys, especially on a wing heavy team like Boston. That really helps you, like to be able to switch onto those guys. He's not going to be a primary lockdown defender on the superstars in the league, but if you know you can switch him on to guys in a switch heavy defense, which the Nets didn't really, don't go crazy with, but like knowing that he's going to be able to get into those switches does really help you and gives you a lot of latitude on the defensive end. You want to talk about where he's going to pair with Simmons. It gets a little weird. A couple non-shooters on the team. You have to feel like maybe the defense that the two bring total makes up for a little bit the lack of shooting that you would have in that lineup. Like everyone else would basically have to be able to shoot lights out and score if you pair them together. But I think you can squint and see it with Simmons and Claxton and from that end, right? Like they're super long. They're going to be able to cover so much ground. Closeouts. There's going to be a lot of very little space for the opposing offense to sort of operate in just because of the overall length that those two guys bring. So I do think those two guys paired on the defensive end would cause a significant amount of havoc for opposing teams. Something that I think the Nets could really play on if they wanted to sow some chaos on the defensive end. I don't know if you want to do it like 30 minutes a game together, but I think you can at least get away with it from stretches because whatever you lacked in spacing, maybe you get in rim running, maybe you get out in transition because you're causing problems on the defensive end. It's going to be really hard for opposing wings, especially or even creators to kind of find good looks with those two on the court. So I think you can put those two guys together and feel, I think, pretty decent about it. And this is where when you come in at a number like $11 million a year for Claxton, at a center position that you can often find cheap options. Like I think we've seen the market for centers begin to dry up here in the recent years. There's questions of guys like Ayton, like what's he even going to get as he enters free agency or if he wants out for the Suns. This is like one of the premier guys. I'm using his as an example because I think we're starting to see how the center market is taking shape. And if you think you can get cheaper guys on the market or in the free agency market, maybe some cast-offs, maybe some retreads, maybe shooting this amount of money at a center isn't totally worth it. But I think Claxton's shown you enough. I think he's shown you enough that, especially when you combine with his age, again, only 23, and I know he's been in the league for 3 seasons now. He only played 15 games his rookie season, never got a start. Only played 32 games his second season, only got 1 start. And then last year he played 47 games, got 19 starts. And so, we're less than 100 games into this guy's career. He's played 94 games. 94 games. Do we think we know the true scope of a player after 94 games and somewhat limited minutes? I would say no. And I think what the question you want to ask yourself at that point is, have we seen enough growth, right? Have we seen a trajectory around his skills? Have we seen him get better at things? Yeah. We've seen him get better at defense. We've seen him get better with his size, like just in terms of putting on muscle. We've seen him get better at finishing around the rim 100%. 100%. Like his confidence around the rim going up now is clearly different than we saw even a season ago, even earlier in the season. I think all of those things have improved. So if you start envisioning in your mind's eye around where the improvements can be, then I think you can start talking yourself into this number, not only on a functional level, but on like a sort of, maybe there's a world where it's a deal in a year from now. Like maybe you're buying still a little bit low. I don't think that's, a huge potential for that. But think about it. Can you see it? Could you see Nic Claxton continuing to gain skills in his age 24 year around all those areas we just talked about? I think you can definitely see it. And if you start to be able to see it that way, then and even if the upside is built in a little into the price because of the age, I think that the Nets think, I can see why they would really want to go back and re-up him here, because worst case scenario, it stagnates a little bit. It's a pretty tradable contract. Like, you can package it together with something else and get something in return on another team that was believing in him. So, and knowing that in the third year it'd be expiring. So I think there's a lot of reasons that the Nets would consider doing this. All right, I want to talk a little bit more about Claxton, talk a little bit about the NBA playoffs that we've been seeing here over the last couple of weeks. First, going to talk to you about our friends over at Bet Online. Bet Online continues to be the number one source for all of your betting needs and sports info. Find all the latest odds, news, and developments. Get rolling through this year's basketball playoffs. They got all the Major League Baseball. I use that every day for Major League Baseball projections. They got the fights on the weekends, NFL futures as well. Bet Online is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, live betting, esports, and more. Head on over to betonline.net. You can learn about all the trends and action. Bet Online, where the game starts. All right, some final thoughts on Claxton before I just talk about the NBA playoffs in general. I think that them bringing back Claxton, it will be interesting to see how they then view a guy like Bruce Brown. Like, if this is the money and maybe the Nets can't, think that they can pay both of these guys in free agency, I wonder if the signal that Nic Claxton could be coming back could also be from the agents too. Like, agents love to kind of put these narratives out there. But like, in general, I wonder if what that does to Bruce Brown too, or if the Nets are in a situation where they're trying to say to themselves, hey, we might need to make a decision one way or the other. Cause if we're talking about sort of the same numbers for Bruce Brown, then we're getting into a weird spot. I think we'll see that sort of play out over the next couple of weeks, obviously, as we get into free agency as well. But I do wonder if one kind of comes at the expense of the other. If one of them is like, if Claxton's the guy, that means like they're going to have to save money on a guy like Brown, who they might see as more expendable, with a guy like Ben Simmons around, who essentially is a bigger version of Bruce Brown. Not totally fair, because Bruce Brown was able to knock down 3-pointers near the end of the season, keep you just a little bit honest. Simmons has never shown the ability to do that, but Simmons can also guard positions that Bruce Brown can't. So you think, and maybe do a little more ball handling as well. So you feel like that's a situation that evens itself out. And look, they're already paying Simmons, so there's no way around that without trading him. So I'm not sure, again, that's not me reporting anything. That's just me thinking about the scenario when it comes to Claxton, saying, if that was the case, then maybe that means that Bruce Brown could be finding another guy, another place to go. Also, you have to wonder about what Bruce Brown's market is just in general. Claxton and Brown's markets are weird. Like, these Nets, couple of these Nets guys, it's hard to know where they fit on the open market. It was hard to know that last year with Bruce Brown before he ended up coming back. So, I think their fates are somewhat tied together, because they're both due for what are clear raises in terms of their salary. And there's going to be a point at which the Nets just probably aren't going to be able to just go with the unlimited checkbook, especially around guys that have limitations. You need to find, or at least limitations that the Nets really need to address, like spacing, like overall length, like being able to shoot the three. The fact that neither do that, I guess Brown does a little. The fact that it's not part of their core makeup, or not part of the first 5 things that they do well, it's going to get a little weird here with these guys in free agency. So overall, though, I think I'm pretty happy with the idea of bringing Claxton back. I think he offers enough of what you're looking for on the team. I think he offers enough upside, just to reiterate some things already said. I think we're going to see, as long as he can maintain some of that health, which has been a little bit of a problem. Some of the injuries have been a little fluky. So I don't know if they're like one-to-one translatable to say he's an injury-prone player. I don't think of him that way. I think he's had some weird flukiness that's happened over the first couple of seasons with him that have started to, sort of get in the way of some of his growth. Maybe he gets through a season here where it's all health, and you're thinking to yourself, man, we really, really got something. And for those 48% of the people out there who did not want him at $35 million total, I think you're going to be saying, get used to Nic Claxton maybe for that number, because I think that's what's going to happen. Okay. Wanted to talk quickly about these NBA playoffs real quick. I'm not going to go through every game here, but these have been the weirdest NBA playoffs I can ever remember. And I'm not admittedly a basketball historian, so if there's other weird ones, shoot them at me. But I can't think of a year where there have been more just games that are just totally unwatchable for the second half on. Like, just games that are utter blowouts, kind of just in the first quarter, and they're over. It's not every game, But the fact that we're this far into the playoffs in the conference championships, and the first 3 games in the Celtics, or excuse me, last 4 games in the Celtics and Miami series were just like over before you even really needed to start paying attention. Like another huge blowout on Monday night, going back to Sunday, Sunday was a huge blowout. Like basically every single game. The first game of the series 118-107. The second game that was in favor of Miami. Second game 127-102. Boston wins, so you flip it back, and then then Saturday you get 109-103. Really wasn't that close because Celtics made up. They outscored them by 9 in the fourth quarter and still lost by 6. That game was essentially over. Made a little bit of a push, I guess kind of late, but for long stretches you thought it was over. And then the Celtics win by 20 over the Heat, 102-82, in a game where the Heat looked like one of the worst teams, not in the playoffs, like in basketball. 82 total points in the playoffs. The Golden State Dallas series has been no better. Those games all got completely out of hand for the most part too. Dallas made a little bit of a push here, a little bit of a push there, but those games were essentially foregone conclusions. I just can't remember a year where the games at the conference champ, these are supposed to be like the best 4 teams left, right? The best 4 teams left in the whole playoffs. And we're just in a situation where their games are blowouts and they're over before you even know it. Like you can turn it off. You feel like you can turn it off in the first quarter. I don't have a grand thought about that. And I don't even think it's total variance around the 3-point shot. It's just such a weird thing that's going on with the NBA. It could be total fluke, just could be total luck around what's happening, that some of these games are just going like this. I don't really know, but I'm just wondering if anyone else is feeling the same way about just being overwhelmingly disappointed by how the playoffs have gone so far when it comes to some of these teams, because like, I don't know, you want this to be the very best basketball you can get. You want these games to be close. You sat the whole season watching hoops and, analyzing stuff, finding what you thought were going to be the trends, finding the matchups that you thought were going to really, really work out. And what happens? You can kind of see, it feels like you can flip a coin for who's going to blow one team out on any given night. And that just doesn't feel like it should be the case with the NBA. Not to say the Nets would have had a better, showing here than any of these teams, but it's just a very, very odd development. So hopefully it evens out. Hopefully we start to see some close games in terms of, just getting close. I think the Warriors Mavericks are just pretty much a wrap, but in terms of at least the Celtics and the Heat, hopefully get a couple close games there. And then whoever goes out there and faces the Warriors in the finals, hopefully that is the, hopefully we maybe get 7 of a close one over there. All right, going to get out of here. Nic Claxton, not signed in stone yet, but signs are pointing toward him coming back for the Nets. We will know all that in the next couple weeks for sure. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Nets YouTube channel. Really appreciate all the comments we've gotten over there. Creston, we're moving toward 3,000 followers over there, subscribers. That is really, really such wind in our sails when it comes to the podcast. Make sure you like and subscribe over on Locked On Nets. Adam's a good one of the quotes, so I will move on with that one. Thanks for listening. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.